Hello, my name is Tia, also known as Costume Fiend because I'm both evil and excessively fond of dressing up. Today I'm gonna wrap up my blabbing about leverage, but first, if you like these rambles and are slightly less broke than usual, I do have a coffee page, and as a fellow poor, if you feel like it, I wouldn't mind a tip. No pressure though. Anyway, without further ado, I left off on the boiler room job, so now it's time to get into the cross my heart job. In the spirit of honesty, it does have a slightly dated trans joke in it, but it's hard to really classify where it falls because basically what happens in the scene is that Hardison needs to gain access to another part of an airport and is given a random ID that turns out to be a black woman's ID. So Hardison pretty much pretends to be a trans man who just came back to work after his surgeries, which makes the other people, like in that section, uncomfortable enough to give him time to figure out what the PIN number was that he needed. I'd actually argue, the most offensive part of it is that he does, for a moment, do a kind of more feminine voice, kind of the straight guy doing the gay guy voice thing. But otherwise, while Hardison does find it embarrassing, they don't really do any bashing of the concept, and he's clearly more embarrassed because he's just having to improvise on the spot that whole thing. I watched the scene with my sister, and she kind of agreed it gets the not as bad as you could have been award. The rest of the episode has no standouts, though, in that regard. It kicks off with the team coming back home after finishing a job off camera. They make a note to point out that they lost some of their gear and had a rough time in the process. At the airport, Nate notices a woman acting strangely and discreetly questions her about it as she makes a phone call. It turns out the woman was a nurse who was being forced to switch out a heart meant to go to a teenage boy in order to give it to a rich man. This understandably sets Nate off due to his own trauma surrounding the loss of his son and combined with his hatred of rich, greedy assholes. Like I mentioned in the other video, this one gets intense. Most of the humor of the episode comes from the vague hints at the job they just came from, but for the most part, Nate in particular is very serious, and Sophie ends up checking in on him to make sure he stays on track and doesn't lose it. The team rescues the nurse's daughter, who, was kidnapped to blackmail the nurse, and things get increasingly chaotic, culminating in the team having to pretend there's a tornado to prevent a plane from taking off, and Hardison ends up having to help land a plane as a result. Ultimately, they're able to get the heart to the kid, but Nate isn't satisfied to just let it end there. In one of his coldest moments in the show thus far, he calls the dying rich man to inform him that he's going to be keeping an eye on him to make sure he doesn't pull shit like that again. When the Mark declares that by doing this, Nate has killed him, Nate responds by telling him that it was actually God that killed him. Nate just made sure it took. Considering Nate is Catholic, there's something about that makes that moment feel extra chilling, but in a good way. This episode ties in with these season-long themes around death and continues playing on the series-long themes surrounding rich people seeing everyone else as puppets or commodities, or in this case, organ donors rather than fully realized human beings. The man literally stole a child's heart, and the worst part is it doesn't even feel remotely unbelievable because cartoon villains have nothing on greedy and powerful human beings. Heavy stuff. This episode is honestly worth talking about more, but since I want to get to the rest of the season, I'm just going to move on to the Queen's Gambit job, where we are once again made to deal with Sterling, Nate's ex-coworker and one of the team's rivals. In the previous seasons, we've seen Sterling smugly get one over on the crew and wind up better off than when he started, which is why him coming to the team for help in this episode throws them off a bit. I was actually going to skip this one, but then I remembered it had a great Parker Hardison moment in it, so I decided to dive in. Essentially what happens is that Parker needs to act as the thief per usual, but this time with weights attached to her feet to fool a security system into thinking she's one of the marks. This frustrates her because being able to move quickly and easily are the things that she feels have kept her safe her whole life. But as he often does, Hardison reminds her that she's not working alone anymore, and he helps her with the weight distribution issue by allowing her to literally step on his toes and help her mimic the Mark's walk. He also starts humming a bit to keep her mind focused, which, given how the team's earbuds work, confuses everyone and amuses Sophie. This isn't the first time we've seen that Parker has a thing for music. She also gets caught up in Eliot singing and Hardison playing the violin in the last season. More OT3 fodder for you. Later on in the episode, when she has to do the job, she requests Hardison starts humming again to keep her focus. You'd think the cuteness peaks there, but you'd be wrong because when things start to go wrong and Parker realizes she doesn't have a clear exit, Hardison helps get her to the top of the roof where he reveals to her that she's got a parachute, and wait, there's more. Normally, Parker would be too light for that to be effective, but then you remember that she has weighted down shoes, and because of that, she's able to confidently jump off the building and land safely to be picked up by the team. A while ago, I saw like this AMV with the OT3 that was to the song Parachute, with this episode serving as a focal point, and to this day it still hits. Maybe I'll link it. I don't know if that would be a good idea or not. AMV is a copyright issue, but it's been up for a long time, so who knows. But anyway, as for the main plot, it turns out that Sterling was actually trying to get his daughter back from her controlling and shitty stepdad, and he confesses that Nate and his crew were the only people he felt he could trust wouldn't screw it up, resulting in one of the realest moments for him on the show. The final scene between him and Nate, where Nate asks him why he never told him about his daughter back when they were coworkers and friends, got to me again. So on top of the Parker Hardison goodness, I decided this episode deserved attention for that as well. But now I'm going to skip ahead to one of my favorite comedic two-parters, the Girls' Night Out job and the Boys' Night Out job. Both episodes take place during the same night and follow the team's separate adventures, divided by their gender as the titles imply. In the first episode, we are set up with the team planning on hanging out with their friends from outside the crew, and them calling Nate out for not having someone else he can hang out with or talk to aside from them and his ex-wife. Parker is also concerned because it's clear she and Hardison have different interests, and she goes to Sophie for advice on how to deal with that. Initially, Sophie is a bit flippant because she's late to her meeting with her friend and colleague Tara, who we actually meet in season 2, where she temporarily acts as the team's grifter in Sophie's absence, partly because I think the actress was pregnant, so they used that kind of like as an in-universe excuse that Sophie was trying to find herself, and she had Tara help them out. Eventually, Sophie, Tara, and Parker get involved in some espionage because Parker's non-work friend Peggy turns out to have been targeted by a thief who wanted to use her invite and catering position at an event to make a deal at the Venezuelan consulate. It's slightly less convoluted than it sounds, but overall it's a funny episode, and it was great to watch Sophie and Tara debate about the methods they use as grifters and see the two of them working together, since in season 2 they didn't actually get to interact much, despite the fact that they are friends, and Parker pretty much spends the night with a thief that has a lot in common with her, but she comes to the conclusion that the night would have been more fun with Hardison and decides to embrace their differences. Meanwhile, in the Boys' Night episode, we are reintroduced to a character named Hurley that we met in season 1, who Nate is not a fan of. He kind of got himself involved in a drug deal that has a lot more going on than meets the eye. Throughout the last episode, Parker had been seen getting advice from Hardison, and when she had him look up a few things, and we are shown him in 3 unusual scenarios, all of which now we get context for. On his end, we see that he's only aware that Parker's hanging out with a mysterious handsome thief, which makes him nervous and act a bit more recklessly than usual, to Eliot's both amusement and frustration. There's a lot going on, but honestly, aside from the crew's interactions, the other standout from the episode are the 2 Irish mooks that were chasing Nate and Hurley around. One of my favorite moments of theirs was probably the one where one of them refused to go into the church to shoot Hurley because it was holy ground, and the other tried to convince him that because they were in the church basement that it didn't count. This episode ends with Nate actually okay with the fact that Hurley kind of is his outside of work friend, Parker's friend Peggy actually forming a kind of connection with Hurley, and Parker and Hardison back on the same page. Well, those things end as usual, justice being served. It's hard to say which of the 2 I like better, but maybe the Boys' Night Out episode has 1 or 2 jokes over the other one, but it's super close. Anyway, skipping ahead one final time, I'm going to move on to the last 2 episodes of the season, where we're taking everything not just from season 4, but also just like in the Girls' Night and Boys' Night episodes, we're revisiting some characters from all 3 past seasons. The first character we revisit being Jimmy Ford, Nate's father, because you see, like I mentioned in the last video, the season-long arc for this season 4 centered around a rich guy named Jack Latimer. He'd been following Nate and his crew and using their takedowns to do well in the stock market, something he offered Nate an in on. Now, on its own, it seems like that's a fine enough season villain, but the radio job is where we get the extra twist, so nothing but major spoilers from now on. It turns out that Latimer was working with Victor Dubenich, who was the first person the team took down in the pilot episode. In the radio job, Nate's father was told that if he didn't steal a particular patent, he would kill Nate. We know as the audience that the relationship between father and son is tense, and the last time we saw Jimmy, Nate had intended for him to retire in Ireland after he forced his father's hand. Despite everything, though, Jimmy loved Nate enough to take the job on, and he spends the episode focused on it and lamenting the fact that maybe it really is time for him to get out of the game. Because, yeah, if you didn't know, he's been a criminal the entire time Nate's been alive, and probably before. Now, the trope of the bad parent making a sacrifice in order to seek redemption is one that's arguably often done poorly. In a weird way, though, I think both Nate and Jimmy being criminals, and similar in more ways than they'd like to admit, for better or worse, it kind of makes it work for this episode, because also it didn't honestly feel like the father was trying to pass himself off as good or even really seek redemption. He didn't even use the he tried his best line, I don't think. When he realized the only way to save his son meant he would die, he didn't hesitate for a moment, and you could tell that he wanted to be remembered for all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I am getting ahead of myself. The episode also allows Eliot to have his die-hard moment where the cops show up, and in order to create a bigger distraction, the team makes it so that Homeland Security shows up. Now, I'm not saying that the cop fell a little bit in love with Eliot, but I'm not saying it either. In any case, while Eliot was playing the man on the inside, Nate spends the episode trying to figure out why everything feels wrong. It isn't until it's too late that he puts it all together, though, and like I just said, Nate keeps Jimmy away long enough. Nope, opposite. Jimmy keeps Nate away long enough to avoid the explosion that ultimately takes Jimmy out. It's another moment that still got to me even after all this time and many a rewatch. When I said the theme of season 4 was death, I meant it. That scene also somewhat reminded me of the season 6 finale of Psych. Spoilers for that, I guess. But Sean, the main character's dad, gets shot, and we're kind of left with a cliffhanger until season 7 opens, with Sean acting a bit unhinged. Except unlike Psych, which leans a bit more towards comedy, we know that Nate has slightly more of the killer instinct in him, and even though he doesn't say anything, you can tell by the look on his face that someone is going to pay for blowing up his father and trying to kill him and the team. This setup into the final episode of season 4 is pretty wild, and the surprises aren't over yet. Now, for slight context, I believe the creators/writers were under the impression that this might be their last season, so if it feels a bit series finale-ish rather than just season finale-ish, that's probably why. It's even called The Last Damn Job, damn spelled without the N, because it's referring to the structure, not the curse word, but more on that in a moment. We open up with Nate meeting Du Benich in prison, where he tells Nate that a man only has 3 things. 1, his business, 2, his possessions, and 3, his name. All of which it's clear Du Benich lost after the team set him up. He even blatantly admits a man would kill over that loss. Knowing that he put the team that started it all together, he leaves that interaction feeling pretty confident, in part because of his knowledge, and in part because Du Benich does not think Nate is a killer. Towards the end of the episode, he brings up the fact that Nate didn't even kill the man behind his son's death, so that kind of is where some of that confidence is coming from. You obviously you would think have a bigger beef with his son's killer, so to speak, than his father's, since they didn't get along. But unfortunately for Victor, Nate is not in a forgiving mood, and to counteract the fact that Victor and Jack know all of them and some of their allies, they decide to recruit some rivals. For Eliot, this means hiring a hitter named Quinn, who beat up Eliot in season 1. They also recruit Hardison's rival, an annoying hacker named Chaos, and Parker's old mentor, Archie. This is where the dam comes in, because Latimer now owns one, which will pretty much give him a lot of control over the water supply. Wonderful. So they use Chaos and Quinn as a distraction, while Hardison and Eliot hack the dam, so to speak, with mussels, which are particularly an invasive species, which will help cause a lot of problems, thus fucking up Latimer's business. In phase 2, Archie helps them to steal an expensive sword from him and make it seem like all of his, fancy art possessions explode. And finally, in phase 3, they go after his name by recruiting Nate's ex-wife to act as a bit of a grifter, and by making it look like he actually ran off with all of his shit and stole some money. Meanwhile, throughout the episode, we see Nate determined to kill Victor, while Sophie and Eliot try to talk him out of it. Eliot specifically coming from first-hand experience about how killing can change you, which, had this been a series finale, would have been built too perfectly. Eliot even thinks about killing Victor for Nate, but realizes that it has to be Nate's choice in the end. The final confrontation takes place back at the dam, and Nate weighs his options while the two men try to out-sleazeball each other pretty much in the hopes that it might save their lives. After seeing his team in the distance, Nate ultimately decides to drop the gun, and because he may or may not have gotten the two men riled up, the both of them end up reaching for it and falling off the dam. Now, the show never explicitly makes it clear that the fall killed them, but let's be real, the fall totally killed them. Sometimes you get to have your cake and eat it too. From start to finish, season 4 of Leverage is pretty much the show, I think, at its best. I love the throwbacks. I love the developing relationship between Parker and Hardison. Hardison even got the unofficial approval of Parker's mentor / father figure, which he's clearly happy about. I also love the times we got to see the team pushed and allowed us and them to contemplate what the right thing is. After all, doing crimes to correct wrongs, can obviously get a bit tricky in terms of who gets to decide who's right and wrong. But ultimately, I think the show, does a good job keeping everything in check. And I think most people are in agreement that had this been the last season, it would have been a satisfying one. But they do get one more chance, and the revival, as far as I know, is still going on. Leverage is definitely one of my favorite comfort shows, and given current events, I think I really needed to see multiple rich, greedy assholes get taken down a peg. And honestly, there's not much left for me to say. So, other than that, leave a like if you liked, subscribe for more nerdy rambling, and as always, have a good one.